So you show up to a men's retreat or some type of event, and they put the guys in a big circle and they're saying, hey, open up, share your heart. Let's dig in together. Have you experienced that yourself? I certainly have. At the very least, I'm sure we've all seen it. This stigma around men being able to open up, to share. We're encouraged to share, but then there's also this dynamic of don't say anything and suck it up and work through it on your own. Even if you do want to open up, there's no roadmap. There's no set path that says, hey, this is how you really do it. So today we're going to talk a little bit about vulnerability and authenticity and how they're intertwined, but they're also very different. And sometimes, in my experience, they can be blurred together and really just misunderstood, in all honesty. I also want to talk about today how Jesus in the Bible models very well for us the differences between the two and how we can walk through that in a healthy way, in a strong way, together as men, and to lead our families well from that, what I would say and argue is a position of strength when it comes to our vulnerability and our authenticity as men. So let's kind of define these two things, and then we'll continue to dig in on that. So a couple of voices that really are familiar to some and maybe not to others. But Brene Brown talks about in the book Daring Greatly, which is a solid read if you haven't already dug into it. But she says, vulnerability is having the courage to show up when you can't control the outcome. I think we can all experience a desire, whether healthy or not sometimes, to want to control our world and the space we're in, or at least the outcome that may come from a relationship, a job interview, a first date, whatever that might be. And then Jordan Peterson, also a voice that probably you've heard. If you haven't, there's so much stuff out there now. I encourage you to look his stuff up. He says, to tell the truth is to bring the most real version of yourself into the world. That's from his book, The 12 Rules for Life. And then Dr. Chip Dodd, another one that I maybe less known compared to like a Dr. Jordan Peterson, but someone who's highly influenced my life, even on a personal level. He says that feelings are not the problem. The problem is what we do with them. And so men often, we either suppress our emotions, believing that that's some kind of strength. But I believe, and I think some of these authors that we've talked about here would argue that really strength is using those emotions more as tools and not really enemies that we need to subdue or hide or get away from. So let's define vulnerability and authenticity. You've probably heard this before. I'm not teaching new things here, but I've got a lot of personal experience in working through this kind of stuff. And so let's just break it down. So vulnerability is this idea of sharing our struggles in trustworthy spaces. And we'll talk a lot about what that looks like, but keep in mind that refers to our context or who we're sharing with, because ultimately at the end of the day, not everyone deserves full access to what's going on in your world. That's probably a pretty small number of people, especially for men when we have, generally speaking, smaller circles. So authenticity, how is this different? I'll define that here as living consistently with your values, even when it's uncomfortable. And so we'll see here in just a minute how Jesus kind of exemplifies that for us and kind of does give us somewhat of a roadmap to follow. But keep in mind, to live consistently in my values, obviously I have to define those first, and what are your values, and what is it that you choose to hang your hat on when it comes down to my values in life, my values in my spouse or future spouse, my values in my work and how I do that, my character, despite the outcome. So kind of back to Brene Brown's quote. But even when it's uncomfortable. So we'll come back to those two, but let's keep digging in. So one story I've got about kind of sharing my struggles in a not so trustworthy space versus a trustworthy space, to kind of give us a picture of that for my own life. Keep it focused on me, and maybe you'll glean something from it. So I talk a little bit about off and on around being a fireman for more than a decade. And so the culture in a firehouse and emergency services, and the only other place you really see that kind of culture is the military. But it really is more of a brotherhood than it is a job. And I got a video coming up real soon about identity, and we're going to dig into that because that's a tricky topic. So the idea is, the situation was rather, in my firehouse where I worked with the same guys, generally speaking, 24 hours on, 48 hours off for years on end with the same guys. And sometimes they rotate out as guys get promoted and new stations get opened up and all that kind of stuff. But I had many years with the same crew. That brotherhood of guys I could share more with. They were more trustworthy for me. They were safer for me to share a struggle that I might have been going through at the time with a girlfriend or with my now wife. I could give them more info, right? I can share more of myself and like feel that that's a safe, those are trustworthy men. They're not going to just completely take that and run with it, right? They're not going to try and use that to manipulate me or to one-up me or to get to a promotion. But I have caught myself, as I look back now, floated to other stations, and although we're still in the same brotherhood in the fire service, if I go to a firehouse in a different state and we start talking about how, yeah, I'm a fireman too, and some experiences, and we have those shared struggles and suffering, even though it's different states, they understand, like when you run a call in this particular type of setting, we can share that. And so we have that commonality and we're still in that brotherhood, but they're not necessarily trustworthy or safe people for me to open up with the same struggles that I would with somebody who I've really lived with and I would consider a brother closer than most of my family. It's just different. And so as we're talking about trustworthy spaces and safe people, that's kind of what I'm talking about. I have definitely shared more in a not safe place with not safe people. And the consequences of that is there's a miss. And there's usually some type of hurt tied to that. Maybe their reaction hits me in a different way, or they just brush it off. And so I don't really feel known or seen in that space. So then what do I do, right? Then I shut down to everybody. Like, oh, well, sharing means this uncomfortable thing, so I just stop. Well, then I'm not really known anywhere else if I just could shut it down. And so here's a fun little story for you and something to kind of show the difference between the two. So let's look at how Jesus modeled authenticity, separate from vulnerability, focus more on authenticity here. So in the book of Mark, especially, we see really throughout the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, and even into the letters to the other churches, where they reference back to situations that they experienced with Jesus, he would often retreat and pray. And so specifically, if you want an example, you can look up, is Mark chapter 1, 35 through 38. But ultimately, the kind of thing I want us to take from that was he stuck to his authentic self because he prioritized his mission over the expectation of others. And so look at, Sermon on the Mount. He gives this message. Thousands of people are trying to follow him. And what does he do after he's done? He retreats and goes to pray. Well, the expectation was, hey, the leader, the Messiah, who's going to save us, who's going to restore us to our right relationship with God, man, he's going to be a conquering king. And there's all these misconceptions around and really unrealistic expectations on Jesus as a man. But he knew, and we're going to come back to this too, he knew he needed to stay on mission. And the only way to do that is to retreat and prioritize time alone with the Father, which is where he got his direction and where he got his motivation and inspiration and life to continue the actual mission. And so he, despite the expectations, he stayed true to that, his authentic self. Another one, Luke chapter 4, 16 through 30. I'm not going to read these just for the sake of time, but go back and dig into them. But we see Jesus speaks truth in the synagogue, even when what he knew, what he was going to say and what he shared enraged the crowd, enraged the people in the synagogue. They hated and despised, especially the Pharisees, right? These were the religious leaders who he most of the time was calling out for their hypocrisy and all these things. He knew this was going to set them on fire. But he also, despite, he wasn't a people pleaser, right? This is his authentic self this is the mission. I'm staying on that, even though when I'm going to step on toes and I know this is going to be a problem for certain people, I'm going to do it anyways. So we'll talk more about that here in a minute. John in chapter 8, verses 1 through 11, we see he engages the woman who's caught in adultery through truth and grace. Okay, so the law said, right, we see again his clashing with the Pharisees, and we see that a lot all throughout Scripture with his life on earth. But he steps in despite what the law said, and he met her with truth and grace, and that truth, which was, hey, let the person without sin cast that first stone. And the word tells us that the Pharisees all started to drop their stones and leave, and it started with the older guys, right? The Pharisees who had been in the game longer, right? Because they knew, I've sinned longer, I've got more history here. They knew when he called them out, man, I'm not without sin. Right? Even though they were like, hey, this is the law and we stand on the law because this is from God. Moses gave us these, right? Jesus is saying, I'm here to fulfill that. That's the mission. And in my authentic self, even though, how could they have reacted? They could have stoned them both, standing there, him and the woman, in where they stood. He knew that risk, but he still stepped into that. It's really a good example for us, of authenticity. Another voice that in this space has really influenced me, and I've had some personal interaction with, is Jeff Schulte. If you ever get a chance to look up 10 Man Ministries, he runs that. It's just an incredible man of God. And when I think of authenticity and vulnerability and men being able to truly process what's going on the inner world and then live out as a whole being, live out our life, he's a pillar in that space. And so definitely look his stuff up. But a quote from him I'll give you around authenticity and masculinity. If you want intimacy, you have to be known. And if you want to be known, you have to tell the truth about yourself. Let that kind of sink in for a minute. What does it mean to be known? And where am I not telling the truth about myself? Where am I lying to myself? But especially when I'm talking about living with other people, where am I not telling the truth? Where am I not being my true self? Not this whole, live your truth kind of stuff. That's not what I'm talking about. It's very different than telling the truth about myself, so that I can be known in a relationship with other people, that I might be known in relationship with God, know him and be known by him, both with God and with other people. That is authenticity in my mind. So it's not about being liked. It's about being true to who God calls you to be. Who has He created us to be? Who has He created you to be? And how are you walking in that? Or are you? If you're not, right, we got some work to do. But even if you have identified that, where are you slipping? I've in that space too, brother, because how many times have I actually sat down and done some of this work and then step back and look and say, oh man, I'm not living that out. Or man, I kind of forgot about this or that. So Jesus never performed for a crowd. He stood firm on His foundation. And so when we look back on His foundation, on His identity, as we look back to how He exemplified authenticity in those specific examples that I gave, in each of those, He stood hard on that identity. He knew who God is. He put God in His right place. He put Himself in His right place. He knew in this moment, and this is a whole another conversation, right? Was God fully man, or Jesus fully man, fully God, and all these types of things. I'm not trying to dig into that right now. But the reality is, He knew in His identity, I am here to accomplish the mission that God set out from the very beginning that will restore the opportunity for right relationship between God and His people, between God and His creation. Okay? And He was able to stand firm on that despite all the pushback, and it took Him to the cross, and it was supposed to. But it took Him to the cross, and he joyfully, right in Hebrews, for the joy set before Him, He endured the cross. He knew the joy at the end of the day was going to accomplish that mission so that you and I could live in right relationship with God, but also in right relationship with each other. So let's look now at how Jesus exemplifies vulnerability a little bit, and then we'll wrap this thing up. So in John 11:33 through 35, we see Jesus openly weeps about losing his brother Lazarus, not his biological brother, but his brother, right? When I think about the fire service and guys that I've led wilderness trips with or just lived life with, I call them brothers despite them not being from the same mom, right? It's just part of what we do, right? But we see he openly weeps, right? People joke about it. You probably, even if you're not a believer, you're in church, you may have heard like the shortest verse in the Bible, right? Jesus wept. It was in a public place. This was with people all around him. That's a vulnerable thing to do, right? That's very much I'm not just boxing this up and bearing it. This is, I'm letting what's happening in my inner world be seen by other people. We're going to talk more about that. But in Matthew 26, 36 through 39, we see Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane, fun word. He shares his deep anguish, right? He knows he's about to go to the cross. He knows it's coming. He's very close to the end of his life. And he shares it with his closest brothers. And so we'll talk a little bit more about this too, but well, I'm gonna punt that. I don't want to over talk about that. But he shares his deep anguish with those closest to him, and we'll talk more about that in a second. And in Luke 23, verse 34, even on the cross, as he's dying, he expresses that pain, but he also asks for forgiveness for those that are hurting him, those that are killing him. It's an incredibly vulnerable space, obviously. He's naked, he's been beaten, he's exposed, fully exposed. And right, that's in the title, right? I'm talking about being exposed and our vulnerability and authenticity and our fear around being exposed as a fraud and all these things, right? Jesus just embraced that. He embraced that because of his identity and his mission. So back to, I mentioned Dr. Chip Dodd earlier. Him and Jeff Schulte actually did a lot of work together. And so you'll see some overlap with those guys. Also, both great resources. It says, weakness is not the absence of strength. It is the admission of our need for connection. So we have deep-seated, God-given needs inside of us, especially for relationship and community. And we can talk more about that in length later on, not in this one. But Jesus shared that in a wise manner. Okay, so he expressed that deep anguish with his closest in the garden, right? We know there were 12 main disciples that Jesus called and was living life with, and hundreds and thousands that were in and out of his world, but the 12 that were with him most closely. But of the 12, there were three: Peter, James, and John. That's his inner circle, right? If you've been a Christian a while, you've been in the Bible a while, you understand that relationship. If you've not heard of that, don't worry about it. Just know that those three were the three that went with him to the garden, and that's who he was most vulnerable with. But then we see, those one-on-one moments with each of the disciples where he was truly intimate, and you see a lot more one-on-one mentorship coming from Jesus in a smaller space. And so that comes a little bit more to our context when we're sharing and being vulnerable. Dr. John Deloney, man, another great voice and resource when we're talking about this kind of stuff. If you've not heard or read his work, a shout out to you, brother. If you ever see this, let's connect, because I'm close to you and near Nashville here. But he says, when we're talking about emotional health, especially for men, vulnerability is sharing what's true in a way that serves connection, not just dumping our emotions on someone. This is not just me saying word vomit, everything that's going on in my world, but it serves to deepen a relationship. It serves to connect us on a deeper level. And I'll share an example about that in a minute. But what this means for men, though, is being vulnerable strategically, right? Strategically makes us a stronger leader, stronger husbands, better friends, and fathers if you've got kids. It helps solidify those relationships, especially. And so a personal story I'll share on that, a time when I did share more vulnerably with a brother on a one-on-one situation, and it served to strengthen that relationship to one that's still continuing to thrive and grow deeper. And so I'll share my brother Cody. If you ever see this, man, love you. And I know you'd be cool with me sharing this, so here it is. So on a 40-day expedition I led in 2020, I was the instructor, there were two of us, one of the instructors, and I had a student on that course named Cody. A very long story short, I'm setting up some rock climbs for the team, and as I'm setting up this climb, my co-instructor is belaying me. I'm lead climbing, so I'm setting protection as I go up, clipping in. I build the anchors at the top of the climb. Cody is standing next to my co-instructor. Like, they are right there at the base of my climb while I'm doing my work. I get it all set up. I kind of inspect the route on the way up. This is a remote climbing area. This is not a frequented climbing area. I mean, we're talking about remote Wyoming. And so as I'm coming down, I bend down, I kind of put my foot on a rock, and I put some sideways pressure, and I lean down to remove my quick draw, my protection that I'd clipped in on the way up. And as I did that, the rocks where my foot was on, there were three massive boulders along with some other small stuff that I had climbed up just fine. But when I put sideways pressure on it, I guess that winter or over the years, freezing and rain and all the things had loosened those rocks. And as I climbed up, they didn't feel loose because it was a huge stack. But when I put that sideways pressure, they gave. And so now I've got these massive boulders from the top of my climb, just below my anchor, that are cascading down towards my co-instructor, towards Cody. There were some other students there, but all I see is rock dust, and I'm grabbing onto the wall as best I can because I didn't know if my co-instructor was gonna let go of the rope, trying to escape, if the rope would be damaged and cut by one of the rocks. I had no idea. I just knew it was very high up. So I'm clinging to the rock. As the dust was settling, of course I yelled, "Rock, rock, rock." Anyways, as the dust was settling, the emotions hit me that I probably just killed somebody on my team. There had been 6 other students at the base of that climb that were just not necessarily right under my belay, but they were close, in the fall zone. But I was overcome by this emotion that I may have just killed somebody, one of my students who I'm there to protect and guide and lead. Of course, I'm yelling, is everybody okay? Everybody check in. No one was hurt. Praise God, no one was hurt. The miracle behind that was all 6 of those other students had left for one reason or another before they were going to climb the ones I was setting up. But there was Nalgene bottles smashed. The rocks literally cut down like 5 and 6 inch aspen trees, just cut them in half and went off into the ground. But anyways, all that to say, I had a one-on-one with Cody afterwards. I had already come down. We met with the team. We debriefed. Everyone feels safe. Some of the people continue to climb. Cody goes and kind of finds isolation. He runs off because he's dealing with this. He's processing that, hey, I could have just been killed. I follow him. And we had an incredible one-on-one conversation where I could have chosen this manly man, I'm going to box everything up and just be, man, I'm okay, so be okay, brother. Like, we're good. We're men. Let's just get back to it. This was only, mind you, I think 12 days or so into a 40-day expedition. Instead, I was open. I was like, man, that just scared the crap out of me. Like, we're both crying because I was terrified I just killed someone. Right? It was a very powerful one-on-one moment. But in that space, in that context, no one else was around, just me and him. We share that. And our relationship since then, and we've talked about this incident multiple times. This was in 2020. We've talked about how it's impacted us even now when we are out in the wilderness and doing different things and living life, and how it just reveals itself sometimes. So all that to say, when you're in the right place with the right people, being openly vulnerable about our inner world can be incredibly unifying and can be incredibly, building up of our relationship, right? Edifying. And so we have to look at those things, like how is this going to really, impact who I'm talking to and me, myself. So where do men get it wrong, right? Where have I gotten it wrong? Where have you potentially gotten it wrong? A lot of times we mistake vulnerability for weakness. That's that tough guy culture. It just shuts down our emotions, right? Like, I don't have emotions. What are you talking about? Like, I'm good. Man, we know you're lying, bro. And you are too, right? I think when we've all probably experienced that, we know, man, I'm full of crap right now. Like, we are emotional beings, designed to be emotional beings. Emotions are not bad, right, in and of themselves, and something to be avoided. But they're tools, rather. They are warning lights for us that something is off. And how can we use that to re-engage in relationship? So that's mistake number 1. Mistake number 2, most commonly, is mistaking authenticity for oversharing. Like, well, let me just dump everything and I'll share all this kind of stuff. If I'm going to be real, well, then here's me, really. But the truth is, no one deserves full access to those thoughts. Not everyone deserves full access to those thoughts and to that part of your inner world, right? Again, it's in context and with safe people. But then there's our third mistake, which is performative masculinity. It's thinking that, like, I have to prove myself instead of just being more solid in my true identity. Again, Jesus is constantly wanting to change parts of our life. Not that, like, oh, change and be a better person, but in our sin nature, there are things that he wants to prune and help us direct onto the right path, on a more healthy path, with relationship with him and with relationship with each other. And so, another Jordan Peterson quote that I love so much: a harmless man is not a good man. A good man is a very dangerous man who has that under voluntary control. So it's about not just being harmless and shutting things down and, oh, this is going to make me a good man, but it's about being, we'll unpack this a lot more later, but the idea being, and I think dangerous is not always a physical danger, although I think that's important, to be a man that is capable of great violence when it comes to protecting our friends and our family and ourselves. That is important, but I think there's a level of danger within our authentic, fun word, within our authentic self and how we're able to articulate that. And there's some great Jordan Peterson work on that actually around dangerous men are articulate men. Fun thing, if you want to look it up on Daily Wire, I believe is where that's at. I know that's where I've seen it. It may be elsewhere in the YouTube land. So where is this applicable? Like, we're going to start shifting now. Let's get into some action steps and some application. So strength and vulnerability are not opposites, right? They go together. And so the more vulnerable and authentic I am in context, right, with those safe people in safe places, but I'm able to then really understand my true identity and to walk in that power and strength. And so what does that look like? All right, so how to apply it? Let's practice strategic vulnerability. Share those struggles, share the real you with trusted people. Not everyone, right? Well, Logan, I don't have trustworthy people, or how do I know this is the right person to be around and that I can share things with? I think if you pay attention long enough as you are talking with people, if they're more interested in one-upping you as you share anything at all, even if it's just a good thing, like, oh man, I just bought this new car. Well, they want to compete with that. Probably not a safe person to share your inner world with, right? If they constantly want to talk about themselves and not truly just say, man, tell me more about what's going on. Like, what do you mean? Like, you know, you're feeling this or you're wrestling with that. Like, give me more of that. Generally speaking, if they're a curious person and they've given you no other signs that they are untrustworthy, or they've given you enough to know they are trustworthy, I say identify that, cultivate that, right? Test it. Start small, test it a little bit. And I think as you test that, it'll become more apparent. Like, okay, yeah, this is a true safe person that I can share with. And then you can expand more on that, right? You can grow together in that. So live authentic in your life, all right? So be honest with yourself. Quit lying to yourself. Quit being okay with lying to yourself and saying that I'm good, I've got this, right? Some of the most dangerous things I've ever said as a man are, I got this, I'm okay. I'm usually not, and I usually don't, right? So be honest with yourself, be honest with other people, even when it's hard, even when it's uncomfortable, right? Just like Jesus gave us that example. When you stand on that true identity, even though you know you're going to rub people the wrong way or certain people the wrong way, but that's your value, stand on that. Practice it. Practice it at home, practice that at work, right? And then again, I think we've talked about this, but look to Jesus for that ultimate model, right? He gives us the ultimate model for what men need when it comes to grit and grace, right? You want to look at someone who's exemplified grit, true, authentic, vulnerable, but grit. Man, so many stories about Jesus that really kind of blew my mind as I began to really seek him out. Right, the image of Jesus just like cuddling with lambs and kids, right? Just, you know, like, yes, he was gentle and graceful, but the man sat and made a whip to drive people out of his father's house, out of the church where they had turned it into a den of thieves. Man, there's so much there around being authentic, strength and grit. Man, I could talk about that for days. So here's your closing challenge, all right, as I wrap this up. Reflect. If you don't already have a journal of some kind, get one. Amazon will have you one there in 2 hours to your house, probably. A cheap little journal that you can write on. And write these questions down. Type it in your phone, right? Whatever you want to do. Where do I need to be more authentic? Where do I need to be more authentic? And where do I need to be more wisely vulnerable? Okay? What areas of your life are you guarding so closely, or hiding or burying so deeply that people don't know you, truly know who you are? again, you really want to live in pursuit of Christ, or even just seeking in that curiosity of, hey man, I'm not a Christian, I don't know about this faith stuff and spiritual stuff. That's fine. If you're curious about truth or spirituality, and you're willing to seek, where are you not being authentic and vulnerable in that space? And write those things down. Write them down. And so I'm just going to end with a quick prayer for you guys. Lord, I just thank you so much for these brothers that have keyed in on this video. And I pray that you would bless them. And I pray that you would help us to have ears to hear what you're saying to us in this message, and the eyes to see where we need to grow and where we need to change and develop and cultivate in our relationships with you and with other people. Lord, we love you and we thank you. Help us to see the path and to walk that. Lord, we love you. All right, brother. See you soon.